I overheard my parents planning to move my sister into my house through the security camera I installed in the living room. Stephen was explaining to Adeline that once Melissa is already settled in, Anna will not have the heart to kick out her own pregnant sister. I saw them measuring my furniture, planning where to put the crib. Adeline tossed my designer blazers onto the bed like garbage. Melissa, 7 months pregnant, plopped on my leather couch, demanding the space. I did not scream. I just laughed. A cold, sharp laugh. If you have ever had your boundaries completely violated by the people who should protect you, tell me where you are listening from right now. They dug their own graves. The laughter faded from my throat, replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. I leaned closer to my monitor, maximizing the video feed from my living room. The high-definition lens captured every agonizing detail. Adeline was not just packing up my clothes. She had moved to the corner of the room right to the drafting table I had painstakingly restored. My heart physically ached as I watched her hands grab a stack of my architectural sketches. These were not just drawings. They were my first conceptual designs, the blueprints that had earned me my university scholarship. She did not even glance at them. She just crumpled the thick, expensive paper and shoved it into a heavy-duty black trash bag. Stephen walked past her carrying a measuring tape, totally indifferent to the destruction happening right beside him. He muttered something about the baby needing good energy, and my life's work apparently did not fit the aesthetic. Then Adeline reached for the shelf above the desk. My childhood design awards, the small acrylic trophies I had won when I was 12. She tossed them into the bag. They hit the bottom with a muffled plastic thud. I sat in my office chair miles away, perfectly still. Decades of living in their shadow had taught me that reacting emotionally only gave them fuel. If I cried, I was being dramatic. If I yelled, I was being disrespectful. They operated under the delusion that because they gave me life, they owned everything I created. My achievements were simply clutter in the way of their golden child's comfort. Melissa needed a nursery. Melissa needed a grand home to impress her wealthy fiancé. And I, the invisible daughter, was just the landlord they did not have to pay. I had spent 4 years restoring this Victorian home. Every hardwood floor I sanded, every window frame I painted was a step toward building a life entirely my own. And now they were trying to steal my peace, but I knew the law better than they did. I watched Adeline tie the black trash bag in a tight knot. She dragged it toward the hallway, treating my history like household waste. This was the defining moment. This was not a misunderstanding. This was an invasion. I reached for my mouse and clicked the download button. The security footage began saving to my encrypted drive, archiving the undeniable proof of their trespassing and vandalism. 4:15 in the afternoon. That was the exact time I decided to erase them from my life. The eviction had just begun. To understand the absolute audacity of what I was watching on that screen, you have to understand the performance Melissa put on just 1 week prior. It was her engagement dinner at an upscale downtown restaurant. The entire evening was a masterclass in manipulation. David is a software engineer. He is brilliant with code, wealthy beyond his own comprehension, and completely blind to human toxicity. He comes from a quiet, normal background. He had no idea he was walking into a viper's nest. I stood in the corner of the private dining room, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching my sister work the room. Melissa wore a modest, flowing dress that perfectly accentuated her 7-month baby bump. She was glowing not from pregnancy, but from the thrill of the grift. David looked at her like she was the only woman on earth. Whenever his glass was half empty, Melissa was immediately there, pouring more wine, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. She played the role of the ultimate traditional partner with terrifying precision. David's mother was there too, a quiet, widowed woman who looked slightly overwhelmed by Stephen and Adeline's loud, overbearing presence. Melissa barely spoke to her, keeping David's attention strictly focused on herself. That slight, almost imperceptible dismissal of her future mother-in-law had caught my eye. At one point, Stephen clinked his glass to make a toast. He praised David for joining the family, but spent most of the speech talking about how pure and giving his youngest daughter was. When it was Melissa's turn to speak, she dabbed her eyes with a napkin. "David." She cooed, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "With me, family is always number one. There is nothing more important in this world than taking care of the people you love. I cannot wait to build our sanctuary together. I gripped my glass tightly. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to laugh out loud. The hypocrisy was physically nauseating. Melissa did not care about family. Melissa cared about status. She cared about David's impressive salary and the social elevation he provided. I watched Adeline beam with pride, nodding along to her daughter's lies. They had all rehearsed this. They were a unified front presenting David with a flawless illusion. David kissed her forehead, completely enchanted. He believed he was marrying an angel. He thought he was marrying into a warm, supportive household. He had no idea that behind closed doors his angelic fiancée viewed him as nothing more than an open checkbook. I watched them toast to their future. I smiled politely when people looked my way. But as I observed Melissa's calculated smiles, a quiet thought settled into my mind. An illusion this polished usually hides a much darker reality. I had to dig deeper. That subtle dismissal of David's mother at the engagement party kept gnawing at me. Sitting in my office with the downloaded security footage safely locked away, I opened my personal email. I needed to verify a suspicion. A few weeks ago, David's mother had reached out to me. Her name is Martha. She is a retired school teacher, a gentle soul who lives on a fixed income. Her email was hesitant, polite, and steeped in quiet desperation. She had asked if I knew any affordable financial advisors. She mentioned almost apologetically that her pension payments seemed to be delayed, and she was struggling with basic grocery bills. At the time, I had thought it was just a banking error. But now, piecing things together, a dark, chilling pattern began to emerge. David is a senior software engineer, making well over $300,000 a year. He has always been incredibly generous with his mother. There was absolutely no logical reason for Martha to be struggling to buy groceries, unless someone was intercepting that generosity. I pulled up a blank document and started typing out a timeline. Melissa had moved into David's luxury apartment 8 months ago. Around the 6-month mark, she volunteered to take over all the household budgeting to reduce David's stress. She claimed it was her way of contributing since she had quit her lifestyle blogging career to focus on the pregnancy. It was a classic isolation tactic. I recognized the strategy immediately. Melissa was slowly, methodically cutting off David's mother. By controlling the finances, she could choke out Martha's financial support without David ever knowing. Melissa was siphoning funds, crying poverty to secure my house, and playing the devoted partner all at once. The sheer scale of the manipulation was breathtaking. She was not just ruining my life, she was destroying an innocent elderly woman's sense of security. Martha was the perfect victim for someone like Melissa. Quiet, polite, and terrified of causing drama for her son, I stared at the screen, my heart pounding with a cold, rhythmic certainty. I could survive losing some old architectural sketches. I could handle Stephen and Adeline's delusional entitlement, but I drew the line at watching a kind elderly widow get financially starved by a parasite wearing a maternity dress. I picked up my phone. I did not call the police. I needed someone who operated in the shadows, someone who dealt in paper trails and buried secrets. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number of a private investigator I had once used to vet a shady contractor. I gave him Melissa's full name, David's details, and a substantial retainer fee paid up front. I told him to trace everything back 12 months, every wire transfer, every credit card swipe, every hidden account. Find the leaks, I instructed, my voice flat. The hunt had officially begun. People often ask how a successful, independent woman could ever be foolish enough to give her abusive parents a spare key to her home. It is a fair question. To understand the answer, you have to understand the anatomy of a narcissistic family system. When you are born into that kind of environment, the toxicity is not an event, it is the atmosphere. You breathe it in every day. I was the designated scapegoat. Melissa was the golden child. My role was to absorb the blame, provide the resources, and expect absolutely nothing in return. It is a psychological trap called learned helplessness. They groom you to believe that yielding your boundaries is the only currency that buys peace. I remember being 8 years old. I had received a beautiful, intricate dollhouse for my birthday from an aunt. Melissa, who was 5 at the time, decided she wanted it. She threw a massive screaming tantrum. Instead of parenting her, Stephen walked into my room, picked up the dollhouse, and handed it to her. When I cried, Adeline told me I was being selfish. "You are older," she had said. "Sharing is your duty." It was never about sharing. It was about conditioning me to surrender. When I was 16, I won a prestigious state-level design competition. I was so proud of the sleek glass trophy. I placed it on the mantel in the living room. 2 days later, it was gone. Adeline had moved it to the garage because Melissa was hosting a sleepover, and the trophy clashed with the party decorations. My achievements were only acknowledged if they could be leveraged, otherwise they were offensive. By the time I was 20, the conditioning was complete. I believed that my comfort was entirely secondary to their convenience. I believed that saying no made me a bad daughter. So 2 years ago, when I finally bought my Victorian home, and Adeline demanded a spare key just in case of emergencies, the programming took over. The little girl who just wanted her mother to smile handed over the brass key without a fight. It was not a gesture of trust. It was the desperate reflex of a survivor trying to avoid a conflict she had never been allowed to win. I had normalized the cruelty. But as I sat in my office, watching the security footage of them measuring my walls, the invisible chains finally snapped. They were never going to love me. They were never going to respect me. No matter how much I surrendered, they would always demand more, until there was nothing left of me but an empty shell for them to inhabit. I did not feel sadness. I did not feel grief. I felt a cold, hyper-focused clarity. The guilt they had planted inside me evaporated. I looked at my spare keys. They thought they were dealing with the obedient 16-year-old they could push around. They were wrong. I was finally wide awake. I ran my hand along the smooth, polished edge of my oak desk. This Victorian house in Lincoln Park was not just a piece of real estate. It was my sanctuary. I had spent 4 grueling years restoring it. I stripped decades of ugly paint from the original molding. I spent countless weekends sanding the hardwood floors until my hands were blistered and raw. Every corner of this space held my sweat, my tears, and my quiet triumphs. I was able to afford the down payment because of my grandmother. She was the only person in my family who ever saw me. While Stephen and Adeline were busy treating Melissa like a fragile princess, my grandmother taught me how to read financial statements. She knew exactly what kind of people my parents were. Before she passed away, she left me a modest inheritance, deliberately bypassing her own son to ensure I received it directly. But she left me something far more valuable than money. She left me a small, leather-bound notebook. It was filled with her handwritten notes on asset protection, legal boundaries, and the importance of financial independence. She had explicitly warned me that blood does not guarantee loyalty. She told me to always protect my kingdom. I had failed her by handing over that spare key. I had let the enemy walk right through the front door. Stephen and Adeline looked at this historic, beautiful home and saw nothing but a free hotel for their golden child. They did not care about the history. They did not care about my hard work. They simply saw an asset they felt entitled to claim. I looked around the quiet, elegant room. The thought of Melissa's entitled presence polluting this space made my stomach turn. I would burn this house to the ground before I let them take it from me. But fire is messy. The law, however, is surgical. I reached for the leather-bound notebook inside my drawer, flipping to the section on irrevocable trusts and corporate real estate transfers. My grandmother had given me the blueprint. It was time to build the fortress. The screen illuminated with a text message from the private investigator. The brief preview read that he had found something significant. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, quiet air of my home fill my lungs. This house had always been my safe haven, the only place where I did not have to shrink myself to fit into their narrative. The intricate stained glass window in the hallway cast a prism of colors across the floor, a daily reminder of beauty and resilience. They wanted to strip all of this away and replace it with their manufactured chaotic drama. I opened the message, my mind already calculating the next necessary steps to protect my sanctuary. I did not go to the police. I did not confront Melissa. Instead, I drove to a small, unassuming diner on the outskirts of the city. The smell of cheap burned coffee and fried food hung heavy in the air. It was the perfect place to remain unnoticed. Martha was already sitting in a corner booth, her hands wrapped nervously around a ceramic mug. She looked exhausted. The vibrant, cheerful woman I had met months ago now seemed diminished, her shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. I slid into the booth across from her, placing a thick manila folder on the sticky laminate table. I did not waste time with small talk. I opened the folder and showed her the financial records I had quietly obtained before hiring the investigator. I showed her the transfers. I explained how Melissa had systematically taken control of David's accounts, silently rerouting the allowance he sent to his mother into her own personal spending accounts. David had not abandoned her. He had not decided to cut her off. Melissa had simply built a financial dam, starving Martha out while playing the devoted future wife. Tears welled up in Martha's eyes as she looked at the highlighted bank statements. The relief of knowing her son still loved her clashed violently with the betrayal of what her future daughter-in-law was doing. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. My voice was steady, professional, and entirely calm. I told her that we were going to fix this, but I needed her to be absolutely brave. I needed her to maintain total silence. We could not tell David yet. If David confronted Melissa now, she would cry, manipulate the narrative, and claim it was a banking error. She would convince him that his mother and I were trying to destroy their happiness. We needed an airtight trap. We needed proof that could not be explained away with fake tears and pregnancy hormones. Martha wiped her eyes, her posture straightening slightly. The initial shock was fading, replaced by a quiet maternal resolve. She agreed to play along. She would continue to act oblivious, giving me the time I needed to gather the final pieces of the puzzle. I ordered a black coffee, watching the waitress move lazily between the tables. The normalcy of the diner contrasted sharply with the profound betrayal sitting in the folder between us. Martha looked at me, a silent question in her eyes about why a sister would go to such lengths to destroy her own family. I did not try to explain the decades of psychological conditioning or the bizarre entitlement Stephen and Adeline had fostered in Melissa. I simply told her that some people view relationships entirely as transactions. To Melissa, David was an asset, and Martha was a liability. I promised Martha that she would get her son back and she would never have to worry about her pension again. We finished our coffee in absolute silence, bound by a shared mission. We forged a quiet, unbreakable alliance. The private investigator was worth every single dollar of his exorbitant fee. 3 days after my meeting with Martha, he sent an encrypted file to my email. I opened it sitting in my quiet, meticulously organized home office. The first document was a comprehensive financial trace. A few months ago, David had taken out a personal loan of $45,000. According to his casual conversation at the engagement party, the money was seed funding for a boutique online business Melissa wanted to start. The investigator's trace proved otherwise. There was no business. There was no inventory. There was no LLC registered in her name. The money had been routed through 2 different accounts and then spent aggressively. Luxury resorts, high-end dining, and expensive boutiques. But Melissa was not traveling with her wealthy, hard-working fiancé. I clicked on the attached photographs. The images were high-resolution, time-stamped, and utterly damning. There was Melissa, 7 months pregnant, standing outside the valet drop-off of a 5-star hotel downtown. She was wearing a designer coat, clinging to the arm of an older, distinguished-looking man. He wore a tailored suit and a heavy gold watch. In the next photo, they were kissing. It was not a friendly peck. It was an intimate, familiar embrace. A wave of profound disgust washed over me. She was not just stealing from David and starving his mother. She was conducting a full-blown affair using David's own money to fund her romantic getaways with a wealthy older man. The sheer sociopathy of it was staggering. She was carrying a child, planning a wedding, and securing her financial future, all while maintaining a secret life on the side. I scrolled through the rest of the report. The man was a wealthy real estate developer, married with a reputation for indulging younger women. Melissa had been seeing him for over a year, long before she moved in with David, long before the pregnancy. I looked at the image of her smiling face, the same smile she used to charm David, the same smile she used to convince Stephen and Adeline that she was the perfect daughter who deserved my house. My heart rate did not elevate, my hands did not shake. The anger I felt was cold, analytical, and entirely focused. I printed the photographs and placed them carefully inside a fresh manila folder. I did not need to scream. The evidence would do all the screaming for me. The drive to the suburbs was quiet. I kept the radio off, letting the rhythm of the highway center my thoughts. I thought about the $45,000. I thought about David pulling late-night coding shifts to provide a beautiful life for a woman who was actively betraying him. I thought about the sheer arrogance required to carry out a deception of this magnitude while pregnant. Melissa believed she was untouchable. She believed that her beauty and her tears were absolute shields against any consequence. Stephen and Adeline had spent 25 years teaching her that the rules did not apply to her. Today, I was going to test the limits of their unconditional delusion. I parked my car on the familiar suburban street, feeling absolutely nothing for the house I grew up in. I walked straight to their front door. I found Adeline in the kitchen, meticulously arranging a vase of expensive imported flowers. She looked up slightly surprised to see me visiting unannounced. I did not offer a greeting. I walked directly to the granite kitchen island, opened the manila folder, and slid the photograph across the smooth surface. Adeline looked down at the image of her heavily pregnant daughter, passionately kissing a wealthy older man outside a luxury hotel. I waited for the shock. I waited for the denial. I waited for the horror that any normal mother would feel upon realizing her child was destroying multiple lives. Instead, Adeline sighed. It was a mild, slightly annoyed sigh, as if I had pointed out a minor stain on the tablecloth. She picked up the photograph, adjusted her reading glasses, and then set it back down. "You always try to find the worst in her, Anna," she said, returning to her flowers. "She is just expanding her network." I stared at her, genuinely wondering if she had lost her mind. Expanding her network, Mom, she is kissing another man. She stole $45,000 from David to fund vacations with him. Adeline waved her hand dismissively. "David is a good boy, but he is just a tech worker. This man is a major developer. Melissa is thinking about the family's future. She is making connections that could help David's career later on. She has beauty, she has to utilize it." The absolute insanity of her logic hung in the air. I kept my voice perfectly level. "She is having an affair, Mom. She is pregnant with David's child and sleeping with someone else." Adeline turned to face me, her expression hardening with arrogant righteousness. "If they truly love each other, they will figure it out. Melissa is a capable woman. If she cares for both men, it lessens the burden on everyone. A house is merrier with more people looking out for it. You are just single and bitter, so you do not understand how modern relationships work." A cold chill ran down my spine. This was not just denial. This was a complete pathological detachment from morality. Adeline was actively justifying fraud and adultery because it benefited her favorite child. She viewed Melissa's deceit as a clever business strategy. There was no bottom to their depravity. Any lingering trace of guilt I had about destroying them vanished completely. There was no reasoning with a disease. There was only eradication. I slowly slid the photograph back into the folder. I did not argue. I did not yell. I just looked at her with a quiet, lethal understanding. Walking back to my car, the sheer absurdity of the conversation echoed in my mind. She can care for two men. It lessens the burden. The words were a toxic lullaby Adeline used to justify her daughter's sociopathy. They had constructed a reality where Melissa could commit any crime, inflict any pain, and remain entirely blameless. I realized then that Stephen and Adeline were not just enablers. They were active participants in the delusion. They fed off Melissa's proximity to wealth and status, willing to sacrifice anyone, David, Martha, myself, to keep the illusion alive. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind shifting gears from investigation to execution. I could not just expose Melissa. I had to dismantle the entire ecosystem that allowed her to thrive. They needed a reality check delivered with the force of a freight train. The game was finally crystal clear. When I returned to my Victorian home in Lincoln Park, the front door was unlocked. I stepped into the foyer and heard the sound of heavy cardboard boxes being dragged across my restored hardwood floors. I walked into the living room. Stephen and Adeline were there, surrounded by packing tape and empty boxes. They had let themselves in with the spare key. They were actively packing my books, my decorative vases, and my personal belongings. They froze for a fraction of a second when they saw me, a brief flash of guilt crossing their faces. But the hesitation vanished instantly, replaced by a wall of staggering arrogance. Stephen dropped a roll of tape and stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest. "Good you are home," he said, as if I had just arrived at his property. "We are getting a head start. You have way too much junk in here." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in my coat pockets. "You are packing my house! You are our daughter!" Stephen declared loudly, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "What belongs to you belongs to the family. We fed you, we clothed you, you lived under our roof for 18 years. It is time you showed some gratitude and paid us back." Adeline chimed in, holding one of my expensive throw pillows like a weapon. "Melissa needs a grand house, Anna. She is marrying into a wealthy family. She needs to match David's status. It is about keeping up appearances. You are single. You do not need all this space." I looked at them, observing their madness with the clinical detachment of a scientist looking at a petri dish. "So I should just leave." "Yielding to your sister is a virtue," Adeline said, smoothly, entirely serious. Consider this a motivation. You are a smart girl. Go rent a small apartment, work hard, and make your own money. It builds character. They were robbing me blind and framing it as a character-building exercise. They believed that because I had always yielded in the past, I would simply bow my head, pack my bags, and hand over the keys to $1 million property. I did not raise my voice. I let a soft, gentle smile touch my lips, a smile that did not reach my eyes. "You make a compelling point," I said, my voice smooth and agreeable. "It is a lot of space for one person. Let us not fight about it today. Leave the boxes. Come back next Saturday evening. Bring Melissa and David. I will cook dinner and we can make the official handover." Stephen grinned, exchanging a triumphant look with Adeline. They had won. The scapegoat had surrendered just like she always did. "That is my good girl, Stephen," said, patting my shoulder as he walked past me to leave. I stood alone in the center of my living room looking at the cardboard boxes they had so carelessly stacked against my antique wallpaper. They had touched my things with such casual disrespect, utterly convinced of their absolute right to claim my achievements. The smell of their cheap cologne and perfume still lingered in the air, a foul reminder of the invasion. I reached down and picked up the roll of packing tape Stephen had dropped on the floor. I traced the sticky edge with my thumb. They wanted this house. They wanted to strip me of my sanctuary and hand it to a parasite. They thought the invitation to dinner next Saturday was a white flag of surrender. They had no idea that they had just accepted an invitation to their own professional, financial, and social slaughter. I turned the lights off, leaving the boxes exactly where they were. The trap was fully set. The next 3 days were a masterclass in silent compartmentalization. Stephen and Adeline thought they had won. They thought the cardboard boxes sitting in my living room were proof of my complete and utter surrender. What they did not know was that I was doing my own packing in the dead of night. Every evening, after the neighborhood went quiet, I carefully wrapped my most prized possessions in thick bubble wrap. I did not pack the replaceable items, I packed the irreplaceable ones. The antique mantel clock I bought with my first architectural paycheck, the silver picture frames holding photos of my grandmother, the original blueprints of my most successful building projects. I carried the boxes down to my car one by one, making sure the floorboards did not creak. I rented a secure, climate-controlled storage unit across town under a newly formed corporate alias. By the end of the week, 90% of my personal history was safely locked behind a steel door, completely inaccessible to the parasites who thought they owned me. The house began to look subtly barren. The shelves were just a little too empty. The walls echoed just a fraction more than usual. But Stephen and Adeline were too blinded by their own greed to notice the hollow space. They only saw the square footage. They only saw the grand staircase where Melissa could take her elegant maternity photos. During the day, I went to my architectural firm and worked with a level of hyper-focus that terrified my colleagues. I drafted building plans, reviewed structural integrity reports, and led client meetings with absolute precision. I channeled every ounce of my disgust into building physical structures that would stand the test of time, unlike the fragile, toxic illusion of my biological family. I was living 2 completely separate lives. During the day, I was an elite professional securing my financial future. At night, I was a ghost, methodically dismantling my own home right under their noses. I did not feel any attachment to the physical house anymore. A house is only a home when you feel safe inside its walls. The moment Adeline tossed my childhood awards into a garbage bag, this place ceased to be my home. It was simply a physical asset, and assets can be easily liquidated. I slid the heavy cardboard box into the trunk of my car, letting out a long, quiet breath. The cold night air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. I looked back at the Victorian silhouette of the house. I had poured my soul into restoring those bay windows and repairing the intricate roofline. A weaker version of me would have stayed and fought a messy emotional battle to keep the bricks and mortar. But I understood now that fighting Stephen and Adeline on their terms was a losing game. They thrived on drama. They fed on emotional reactions. By removing the things I truly cared about in absolute silence, I was starving them of their power. They wanted a battlefield. I was leaving them an empty stage. I closed the trunk quietly, the soft mechanical latch sealing my history away from their grasping hands. I walked back inside, ready to face the empty rooms. I taped the final box. With my physical belongings secured, I turned my attention to the digital war room. I sat at my empty desk, the blue light of my monitor, illuminating the dark room. I opened a new encrypted folder on my desktop and began dropping the pieces of the guillotine into place. First, the security camera footage. The crisp, high-definition video of Stephen and Adeline entering my property without permission, digging through my closets, and throwing my history away. I converted the files into a format that could be easily played on any standard device. Next came the financial records. Martha had quietly managed to photograph some mail that Melissa had carelessly left on David's kitchen counter. It was a credit card statement. A card taken out in David's name maxed out to $12,500. The purchases were entirely for luxury maternity wear, high-end spas, and expensive jewelry. Melissa had been slowly bleeding him dry, making minimum payments from his own checking account to keep him completely oblivious. I scanned the statement and added it to the digital folder. Then, the crown jewel. The private investigator had managed to secure a medical billing record from the high-end clinic Melissa visited. Through a series of brilliant, perfectly legal inquiries, he confirmed that the prenatal DNA testing did not match David. The child belonged to the wealthy real estate developer. I looked at the 3 files sitting side by side on my screen. Trespassing, financial fraud, prenatal fraud. Each one was a devastating blow on its own. Together, they were an apocalyptic event. I did not feel a sudden rush of adrenaline. I did not feel the fiery heat of vengeance. I felt the cold, satisfying weight of absolute justice. For 29 years, they had manipulated the narrative. They had gaslighted me into believing I was the problem. They had used emotion, guilt, and family loyalty to keep me compliant. But data does not feel guilt. Bank statements do not care about family loyalty. DNA results do not bend to Adeline's twisted, enabling logic. I transferred the files onto 4 pristine, identical USB drives. I placed each drive into a crisp manila envelope. I printed out hard copies of the most damaging documents highlighting the massive, fraudulent numbers in bright yellow ink and slid them in alongside the drives. I sealed them with absolute precision, running my thumb along the edges to ensure they were sharp. I stacked the 4 envelopes neatly on the corner of my desk. They looked so harmless, just brown paper and printed ink. Yet they contained enough destructive force to obliterate 3 lives in a matter of minutes. I sat back in my chair staring at the stack. I thought about David, the gentle software engineer who was currently picking out cribs for a child that was not his. I thought about Martha skipping meals because a parasite had stolen her safety net. They did not deserve this. They were collateral damage in Melissa's endless quest for a superior lifestyle. By compiling this evidence, I was not just protecting my own boundaries. I was acting as a shield for the innocent people my family had decided to victimize. The guilt of destroying my biological family was completely replaced by the fierce protective instinct I felt for strangers. I locked the envelopes inside my desk drawer. The paperwork was finally complete. Wednesday morning, my phone chimed with a distinct, sharp beep. It was a notification from my secure banking app. A corporate wire transfer had just cleared. It was the performance bonus from a massive commercial redesign project I had spearheaded over the past 8 months. The number staring back at me was staggering. It was more than Stephen made in 2 entire years selling cars. Normally, a dutiful daughter would call her family to share the good news. She would invite them out to a celebratory dinner, pay the exorbitant bill, and listen to them subtly diminish her accomplishment while ordering the most expensive wine on the menu. I simply swiped the notification away and locked my screen. My wealth was my armor, and I was not about to hand my enemies a map of my armory. I logged into my brokerage account and quietly invested the entire sum into a diversified portfolio. No one knew about it. Not my colleagues, not David, and certainly not the parasites planning to occupy my living room. It was a surreal experience existing in this dual reality. To Stephen and Adeline, I was the defeated, obedient scapegoat who had finally accepted her place at the bottom of the hierarchy. They texted me daily, sending me links to cheap rental apartments in unsafe neighborhoods, pretending they were doing me a massive favor by helping me relocate. I replied with polite, non-committal emojis. To the rest of the world, I was a highly successful architect at the top of her game, quietly accumulating wealth and building an impenetrable fortress. I walked through the sleek, glass-walled corridors of my firm, wearing a sharp, tailored suit, feeling a strange, intoxicating sense of absolute power. They believed they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had left me with absolutely no options. But they forgot that I build things for a living. I understand load-bearing walls. I understand structural weaknesses. And I understood exactly where to strike to make their entire foundation crumble into dust. I sipped my black coffee looking out over the Chicago skyline. The city was vast, cold, and beautiful. It was a place where facts mattered far more than feelings. I was ready for the weekend. I pulled up the blueprints for my next major project, letting the complex geometry calm my mind. Architecture is about anticipating stress. You calculate the exact amount of pressure a beam can take before it fractures. Human beings are no different. Stephen relied on his booming voice and patriarchal authority. Adeline relied on emotional manipulation and weaponized guilt. Melissa relied on her perceived innocence and stolen money. Individually, they were incredibly toxic, but together they formed a rigid structure, built entirely on the assumption that I would never push back. They had never reinforced their foundation against a genuine threat because they never viewed me as one. By Saturday night, I was going to apply maximum pressure to the exact points where their lies intersected. I checked my bank balance one last time, feeling the profound safety that comes with total financial independence. They could not threaten my survival anymore. The hunter was fully armed. The arrogance of a narcissist who thinks they have won is a truly spectacular thing to witness. It was Thursday afternoon when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed with Melissa's name. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing before sliding my finger across the screen. "Anna," she said. It was not a greeting. It was a summons. "Hello, Melissa," I replied, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. "Listen, I was at your house with Adeline today," she started, the entitlement radiating through the speaker. "We were looking at the guest room, the one with the bay windows. The gray curtains in there are incredibly depressing. It is going to be a nursery. It needs to be bright and cheerful." I waited. I knew exactly what was coming next. "I found these gorgeous custom silk drapes in blush pink," she continued, not missing a beat. "They are $3,000. Since you are saving so much money by not having a mortgage next month, I think it is only fair that you pay for them. Consider it an early baby shower gift." The sheer unadulterated audacity was almost impressive. She was kicking me out of my own home, moving in with her fraudulently financed lifestyle, and demanding I buy her luxury curtains as a parting gift. The old me would have felt a familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. The old me would have tried to negotiate, maybe offering to split the cost just to avoid a tantrum. The new me simply smiled at the blank wall of my office. "You know what, Melissa?" I said, my tone dripping with honeyed compliance. "You are absolutely right. The gray is a bit harsh for a baby. You should order whatever you like." There was a brief pause on the line. Even she was surprised by how easily I had folded. "Really?" she asked, a smug satisfaction creeping into her voice. "Well, good. I will send you the invoice." "Do whatever makes you happy, Melissa," I told her softly. "The house is going to have a new owner very soon. They will take care of absolutely everything." She laughed, completely misunderstanding my meaning. "Exactly. I am glad you are finally accepting reality." She hung up. I set the phone down on my desk. She thought she was the new owner. She had no idea how literal my words actually were. I stared at the darkened screen of my phone, marveling at the utter lack of conscience required to make that phone call. $3,000 for silk drapes. She was casually spending David's stolen money on hotel rooms with her lover, yet she still felt entitled to extract thousands from the sister she was actively displacing. It was a disease of infinite hunger. If I gave her the drapes next week, it would be the nursery furniture. The week after that, she would demand I pay the property taxes because I was technically still family. It was a black hole of consumption, but that phone call confirmed something crucial. She was completely off her guard. She was so convinced of her own superiority that she did not suspect a single thing. Her arrogance was the final ingredient I needed to ensure the trap would snap shut perfectly. I picked up my pen and went back to reviewing my floor plans. I let her dream. Saturday evening arrived with a quiet, icy chill in the Chicago air. The Victorian house looked absolutely magnificent from the outside. The porch lights cast a warm, golden glow against the restored brickwork. Inside, the stage was set with meticulous, terrifying perfection. I had spent the afternoon preparing a classic heavy roast beef dinner. The rich, savory aroma of roasted garlic and rosemary filled the hallways, creating an illusion of warmth and domestic bliss. The long mahogany dining table was draped in a pristine white linen cloth. I polished the crystal wine glasses until they caught the light of the chandelier, reflecting tiny, sharp prisms across the room. It looked like a magazine cover. It looked like a celebration. But the house was a hollow shell. My closets were entirely empty. My valuable artwork was gone. The only things left were the heavy furniture they intended to steal and the props required for tonight's performance. I walked around the table, placing the silverware with mathematical precision. Then I brought out the centerpieces. I placed 4 thick, heavy manila envelopes on the table, one at Stephen's designated seat at the head of the table, one at Adeline's seat to his right, one at Melissa's seat to his left, and one directly across from her, perfectly centered on David's pristine white plate. Each envelope contained a tailored collection of financial ruin, criminal evidence, and absolute truth. They were the culmination of 29 years of enduring their psychological abuse. They were the physical manifestation of my newly forged titanium boundaries. I stood at the end of the table wearing a simple, elegant black dress. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. My posture was straight. My expression was serene. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. There was no fear left in my body. The digital clock on the mantel shifted quietly. 6 o'clock in the evening. Right on cue, the heavy brass doorbell echoed through the empty foyer. I heard the muffled sound of Melissa's high-pitched laughter filtering through the thick oak door. The vultures had arrived for their feast, entirely unaware that they were actually the main course. If you know that feeling of false peace right before a storm, drop A in the comments. As I walked toward the entryway, I evaluated the structural flow of the wainscoting I had installed myself. I was mourning the house, but I was not mourning the family standing on the porch. For years, I had dreaded family dinners. I had dreaded the constant comparisons, the subtle insults disguised as advice, and the overwhelming feeling that I was an imposter in my own life. Tonight was different. Tonight I held all the cards. I was the architect, and this was my final masterpiece. I took one last deep breath, letting the smell of the roasted garlic ground me in the present moment. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open, greeting them with the very same polite, compliant smile I had worn for nearly 3 decades. Adeline pushed past me immediately, her eyes already scanning the living room to assess her new territory. Stephen followed, clapping David on the back in a show of manufactured camaraderie. Melissa trailed behind, holding her pregnant belly, looking around as if she already owned the very air we were breathing. I opened the door. To understand the absolute finality of the trap I had set, you have to rewind exactly 48 hours before the dinner. It was Thursday evening. The sun was setting over the Chicago skyline, casting long golden shadows across the empty hardwood floors of my living room. Most of my belongings were already safely locked away in the storage unit. The house felt vast and echoing, stripped of its soul. I stood by the large bay windows looking out at the quiet, tree-lined street. I loved this house. I had poured my blood, sweat, and savings into its walls. But holding on to a physical building while allowing toxic people to occupy it is not a victory. It is simply choosing a beautiful prison. To truly defeat parasites, you have to completely remove the host. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a direct number I had acquired through a high-end corporate contact. I was not calling a friendly local real estate agent. I was calling Vanguard Commercial Real Estate, an aggressive investment firm known for buying properties for cash and flipping them with ruthless efficiency. A senior acquisitions director answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I gave him the address of my historic Lincoln Park home and offered him a deal he could not refuse. I was willing to sell the property at 15% below market value. In exchange, I required 3 non-negotiable conditions. I wanted a cash transaction. I wanted the transfer of title to happen within 24 hours. And I wanted absolute confidentiality until the ink was dry. The director paused, likely running the numbers on his dual monitors. A historic Victorian home in a prime neighborhood, offered at a steep discount with no contingencies. It was a corporate shark's absolute dream. "We can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow morning," he said smoothly. I agreed and hung up the phone. A heavy, profound silence settled over the room. Giving up the house was the price of my absolute freedom. Stephen and Adeline thought they were dealing with an emotional, easily manipulated daughter who would cry over losing her living room. They did not understand that I was operating as a completely detached strategist. I looked at the floorboards I had sanded by hand. They were just wood. The true foundation of my life was my own independence, and that was something they could never, ever touch. I analyzed the empty corridors one last time, touching the intricate moldings. The scent of old pine and fresh wax still lingered. I knew that by Saturday night this beautiful space would become a battleground. But it would not be my battlefield. It would be their graveyard. I had learned a vital lesson over the past 2 weeks. You cannot negotiate with people who view your boundaries as an insult. You can only outmaneuver them. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and raised it to the empty room, to new beginnings, and to the absolute destruction of old habits. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the Victorian house into darkness. The deal was officially struck. Friday morning, I sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise. Across from me sat the Vanguard acquisitions director and 2 corporate attorneys. Between us rested a stack of legal documents. This is where the true power of a process-driven consequence comes into play. Toxic families thrive in the murky, emotional waters of family disputes. If Stephen and Adeline moved Melissa into my house and refused to leave, calling the police would result in a massive headache. Law enforcement often writes those situations off as civil matters, forcing you into months of grueling eviction proceedings, while the abusers destroy your property and drain your energy. I was not going to let that happen. I picked up the heavy brass pen and signed the final page of the irrevocable sales contract. With that single stroke of ink, the property legally ceased to be my personal residence. It was instantly absorbed into a massive corporate holding company. It became a protected asset of Vanguard Commercial Real Estate, LLC. The brilliant reality of this mechanism is its absolute lack of emotion. A corporation does not care if you are a pregnant sister. A corporation does not care about Adeline's manipulative logic or Stephen's patriarchal demands. If an unauthorized individual occupies a corporate-owned property, it is no longer a messy family dispute. It is classified as criminal trespassing on commercial property. The police do not tell a billion-dollar investment fund to work it out in civil court. They arrive with handcuffs. The notary stamped the documents, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet room. "The funds will clear your account within the hour," the director said, sliding a copy of the finalized contract toward me. "Our security team will take possession of the property at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning." I smiled, sliding the folder into my leather briefcase. I had 24 hours left in the house, just enough time to host one final, unforgettable dinner party. I walked out of the high-rise and stepped onto the bustling Chicago street. The cold wind whipped past me, but I felt incredibly warm. I had converted a massive vulnerability into liquid capital, and I had handed my family's delusion over to a corporate machine that would chew them up and spit them out. As I walked toward my car, I thought about the sheer elegance of the law. Abusers rely on your emotional attachment to keep you trapped. They weaponize your guilt. But when you remove the emotion, when you reduce the conflict to pure, unadulterated legal mechanics, their entire strategy falls apart. Adeline's tears would not work on a corporate lawyer. Stephen's booming voice would not intimidate a hired security firm. I had spent my whole life trying to fight them with words and feelings, only to be crushed every single time. Now I was fighting them with binding contracts and federal property laws. It felt like I had finally cracked a code that had baffled me for 3 decades. I slid behind the steering wheel, the heavy briefcase resting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. Everything was perfectly aligned. The trap was now inescapable. The scent of roasted garlic and rosemary hung heavy in the dining room. It was Saturday evening. Stephen, Adeline, Melissa, and David were seated around my mahogany table. The 4 thick manila envelopes rested quietly at their respective place settings, completely ignored in the lively artificial chatter. Stephen poured himself a generous glass of my most expensive red wine. He tapped his knife against the crystal edge, demanding the room's attention. He stood up, puffing out his chest completely in his element. "I want to make a toast," Stephen began, his voice booming with forced warmth. "To family, to sacrifice, and to new beginnings." He looked directly at David, offering him a broad salesman's smile. "David, my boy, you are marrying a wonderful woman. Melissa is going to be an incredible mother, and as a family, we take care of our own. That is why I am so incredibly proud of Anna today." He gestured toward me with his glass. Adeline beamed, placing a hand over her heart. Melissa stroked her belly, looking at me with a sickeningly sweet, condescending smile. Anna has decided to step aside, Stephen declared smoothly, weaving the ultimate lie right in front of David. She is gifting this beautiful historic home to Melissa and David to start their new family. She recognizes that a single woman does not need all this space, and she is happily moving out so her sister can thrive. That is what real family does. They yield to each other. David looked at me genuinely touched. Anna, I had no idea. We were going to buy our own place. This is incredibly generous of you. Are you absolutely sure? The sheer audacity of Stephen's narrative was breathtaking. They were not just stealing my home. They were making David believe it was a voluntary, loving gift. They were forcing me into a corner where denying it would make me look like a bitter, unhinged sister ruining a beautiful moment. It was the exact same tactic they had used since I was a child. I did not flinch. I picked up my wine glass by the stem. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red liquid. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, savoring the absolute control I held in the room. I set the glass down on the table. It did not make a single sound. If you're ready for the most satisfying takedown of the year, make sure you're subscribed right now. The tension in the room shifted imperceptibly. Stephen's smile faltered just a fraction as my silence extended. Adeline shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting between me and David. They expected me to nod humbly. They expected me to play the role of the dutiful, defeated sibling. Melissa leaned forward, ready to offer a fake, tearful thank you. But my face remained perfectly blank, an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I let them sit in the awkward, heavy quiet, allowing the weight of their own lies to suffocate the air around them. David's appreciative smile slowly faded into a look of slight confusion. He could sense that something was deeply wrong, though he had no idea what it was. I rested my hands flat on the cool linen tablecloth. I looked directly into David's eyes. "I am not giving Melissa this house, David," I said. My voice was low, incredibly calm, and completely devoid of emotion. Stephen immediately slammed his hand on the table. "Anna, what is wrong with you? We agreed." We did not agree to anything. I interrupted, my tone slicing through his booming voice like a surgical scalpel. I kept my gaze locked on David. I did not even look at my parents. "David, please open the envelope in front of you." David blinked, startled by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. He looked down at the thick manila envelope resting on his plate. He picked it up, his hands moving hesitantly, and peeled back the metal clasp. "Anna, stop this nonsense right now," Adeline hissed, panic finally leaking into her voice. Melissa sat frozen, her hand hovering over her pregnant stomach. David pulled out the stack of documents. The first page was a high-resolution 8x10 photograph. His breath caught in his throat. It was the picture of Melissa, heavily pregnant, deeply kissing the older, wealthy real estate developer outside the luxury hotel. "What is this?" David whispered, his voice cracking. He flipped to the next photo, the two of them walking into the hotel lobby, her arm wrapped tightly around his waist. "Look at the next page, David," I instructed softly. He pulled out the financial trace from the investigator. This is the $45,000 loan I took out," he said, his eyes scanning the highlighted numbers. "The seed money for her business." "There is no business, David," I explained, maintaining my steady clinical tone. "She routed your loan through 2 hidden accounts and spent it on luxury vacations and high-end hotels with that man. She has been seeing him for over a year." The color drained completely from David's face. He looked like a man who had just been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute. He stared at Melissa, who was now pale and trembling, her angelic facade completely shattered. "David, baby, let me explain," Melissa stammered, reaching a shaking hand across the table toward him. "Those pictures, it is not what it looks like. He is just an investor. You were kissing him," David interrupted, his voice hollow and deeply traumatized. He looked at the bank statements again, his hands beginning to shake. "You spent my money. You spent the money I worked for on him." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The polished illusion had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right on my dining room table. I watched the realization wash over David's face, transforming his initial shock into profound, devastating grief. He had given this woman everything. He had trusted her completely, ignoring any subtle red flags because he wanted to believe in the beautiful life she promised. And right in front of him lay undeniable, heavily documented proof that she viewed him as nothing more than a gullible ATM. Adeline stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor, her mind desperately racing to construct a new reality to protect her favorite child. Stephen looked completely bewildered, staring at the photographs as if they were written in an alien language. The pristine, elegant dinner party had completely dissolved. The roasted beef sat untouched, rapidly cooling on the elegant serving platter. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction. The execution was proceeding flawlessly. David stood up so fast, his heavy dining chair crashed backward onto the hardwood floor. The loud, violent clatter made Melissa flinch, pulling her arms defensively over her chest. "How could you do this?" David yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. It was the first time I had ever heard the gentle software engineer raise his voice. "I trusted you. We are having a baby." Adeline, operating on decades of toxic delusion, rushed to Melissa's defense. She moved around the table and placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "David, please calm down," Adeline pleaded, using her most patronizing, soothing tone. "You are overreacting. Melissa is just expanding her network. This man is a very powerful developer. She is doing this for your future. She has to utilize her connections." David turned to look at Adeline, his face contorted in absolute horror. He literally could not comprehend the words coming out of her mouth. "Expanding her network, she is sleeping with him, with my money. If you truly love her, you will forgive this." Adeline continued, doubling down on the insanity. "She is a capable woman. If she cares for both of you, it lessens the burden on you. A house is merrier with more people, David. You need to be open-minded." David let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded almost unhinged. The sheer psychological sickness of the family he was about to marry into was finally fully visible. He looked down at the documents again, flipping to a separate page I had included at the back. It was a summary of Martha's missing pension funds. "My mother," David whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying low. He looked up at Melissa, his eyes burning with pure hatred. "You isolated my mother. You told me her pension was delayed, but you were intercepting her mail. You left her struggling to buy groceries while you were staying in five-star hotels." "David, no, I swear I was going to fix it." Melissa sobbed, the fake tears finally flowing freely. "We are done," David stated, his voice completely devoid of the love he had shown an hour ago. He gathered the documents and shoved them into the envelope. "The wedding is canceled. I am taking these files straight to my lawyer on Monday morning. I am suing you for every single cent you stole from me." He turned on his heel and marched toward the hallway. Melissa let out a desperate wailing cry, trying to stand up and run after him, but her heavy stomach threw her off balance. She sank back into the chair, burying her face in her hands. Stephen finally found his voice, his face flushed a dark, angry red. He lunged toward me, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. "Look what you did. You ruined your sister's life out of pure jealousy. You are a sick, twisted girl, Anna." I did not move. I did not flinch away from his pointing finger. I simply looked up at him, my expression radiating an absolute chilling calm. He thought the destruction was over. He thought David leaving was the worst thing that could possibly happen tonight. He was incredibly, catastrophically wrong. The financial ruin was just the opening act. The main event was sitting in the other 3 envelopes. I reached out and tapped my manicured fingernail against the envelope sitting at his place setting. The alliance had completely collapsed. David was gone. The heavy mahogany front door had slammed shut behind him, leaving a profound, ringing silence in the dining room. Melissa was sobbing into her hands, the sound raw and incredibly ugly. Stephen and Adeline stood frozen, their manufactured reality crumbling around them. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my chair. I simply reached across the table and pushed the 2nd and 3rd manila envelopes toward the center of the white linen cloth. "We are not finished," I stated, my voice as flat and cold as a sheet of winter ice. Stephen stared at the envelopes as if they were venomous snakes. He refused to touch them, so I opened them myself. I pulled out the crisp white medical document and read the highlighted text aloud. It was the prenatal DNA test. It confirmed with 99% scientific certainty that the real estate developer was the biological father of the child Melissa was carrying. In this state, I explained calmly, looking directly at my sister's tear-streaked face, intentionally misleading a partner into assuming financial and legal responsibility for a child that is not theirs constitutes prenatal fraud. It is a civil offense. David's legal team is already drafting the lawsuit. Adeline gasped, clutching the edge of the dining table to steady herself. But I was still holding the third envelope. I pulled out the banking statements and the flash drive containing the security footage. And then there is the matter of the $12,500. I continued sliding the credit card bills toward Adeline. You and Melissa used my spare key. You entered my private residence without my consent. You found my backup credit card in my desk drawer and used it to fund Melissa's luxury maternity wardrobe. We are family, Adeline shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer panic. You cannot call it stealing when it is your own sister. The federal banking system strongly disagrees, I replied smoothly. Identity theft and credit card fraud exceeding $10,000 is a felony. The security camera footage on that flash drive clearly shows you digging through my private files. You did not just break my trust, you broke the law. They had spent 29 years treating me like a communal resource. They believed their shared DNA gave them absolute immunity from any earthly consequence. They were about to learn that the justice system does not care about their toxic family dynamics. I watched the color drain completely from Stephen's face. He looked at the documents, then looked at me, finally realizing that the obedient, quiet daughter he thought he could bully was completely gone. I let them sit with the sheer weight of the impending criminal charges. Adeline's chest heaved as she struggled to draw breath. She looked around the beautiful Victorian dining room, her eyes darting from the crystal glasses to the untouched roast beef, as if searching for a way to rewind time to an hour ago. But time only moves in one direction. You cannot undo a felony just because you regret getting caught. Melissa had stopped wailing and was now staring at the table in a state of catatonic shock. The luxury lifestyle she had so meticulously planned, funded by David's hard work and my stolen credit, was evaporating into thin air. Stephen finally balled his hands into tight fists, his knuckles turning white. He was a man who relied entirely on intimidation, and he was furiously searching for a way to assert his dominance over a situation that had completely slipped from his grasp. The trap was closing fast. Stephen slammed both of his hands onto the dining table. The silverware rattled against the porcelain plates. He took a heavy step toward me, trying to use his physical size to regain control of the room. It was the exact same intimidation tactic he had used when I was a teenager. You listen to me very carefully, Anna. Stephen growled, his voice thick with desperate rage. You are not going to press any charges. You are not going to call any police. This is a family dispute, and you certainly are not going to kick us out of this house. We have already moved our things into the basement. I am your father, and I say we are staying. I looked up at him. I did not shrink back. I did not break eye contact. I offered him a very soft, incredibly polite smile. You are absolutely right, Stephen, I said quietly. I had stopped calling him Dad hours ago. I am not going to kick you out of this house. He let out a short, triumphant breath, believing his intimidation had finally worked. Adeline's shoulders dropped in relief. Then I slid the fourth and final envelope across the table. I cannot kick you out, I explained, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room, because I no longer own this property. Stephen frowned, his eyes narrowing in confusion. He snatched the envelope from the table and ripped it open. He pulled out the heavy notarized contract. It bore the massive red corporate seal of Vanguard Commercial Real Estate, LLC. At exactly 10 o'clock yesterday morning, I stated, reciting the facts with surgical precision, this historic Victorian home was sold. It is now the exclusive corporate asset of a $1 billion investment fund. The transaction was a cash buyout. The deed has already been legally transferred. Stephen stared at the corporate seal, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. Adeline let out a soft, horrified whimper. So, you see, I continued gently, you are not dealing with your compliant daughter anymore. You are currently occupying a federal commercial property without authorization. If you refuse to leave, it is not a family squabble. The corporate security team will arrive, and they will have you arrested for commercial trespassing. The absolute finality of the document crushed the remaining air out of the room. They could argue with me. They could try to manipulate my emotions. But they could not argue with a binding, heavily fortified corporate real estate contract. They had wanted the house so badly they had completely blinded themselves to the possibility that I would simply liquidate the battlefield. I checked my watch. I watched Stephen's eyes scan the complex legal jargon on the paper. He was a car salesman. He understood the absolute unyielding nature of a signed contract. He understood that there were no loopholes here, no grace periods, and no managers he could complain to. The house was gone. The asset was protected by an army of corporate attorneys who would not hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened their investment. Adeline reached out with a trembling hand, touching the edge of the paper as if it might burn her. All her grandiose plans for a lavish nursery, all her delusions of hosting high society parties for Melissa's wealthy friends, turned to ash in an instant. They had walked into this house believing they were the absolute masters of my universe. Now they were just 3 trespassers standing on a floor they had no legal right to touch. The reality of their total defeat was settling over them like a thick, suffocating blanket of heavy winter snow. The countdown had officially started. Denial is a remarkably stubborn disease. Even when faced with undeniable stamped legal documentation, the toxic mind searches desperately for an illusion to cling to. Adeline suddenly pulled her smartphone from her purse. Her hands were shaking violently, but her eyes burned with a sudden manic spark of hope. "You cannot do this," she stammered frantically, dialing a number. "We have squatters' rights. We moved our boxes in yesterday. We have a verbal agreement from you. Mr. Harrison will fix this. He will stop this illegal sale." Mr. Harrison was their aggressive, overpriced family attorney. He was the man they usually called to bully small contractors or intimidate unhappy customers at the car dealership. Adeline put the phone on speaker and set it on the table. It rang twice before the lawyer's gruff voice filled the dining room. "Adeline, it is Saturday night. What is the emergency?" he barked. "Mr. Harrison, it is Anna," Adeline cried out, her voice dripping with manufactured victimhood. "She is trying to illegally evict us. We already established residency in her home, and now she claims she sold it to some company. You need to file an injunction immediately to protect our squatters' rights." "Hold on, Adeline," the lawyer said, his tone instantly shifting into aggressive defense mode. "Anna, if you are listening, you cannot execute a sale with tenants currently residing in the property. They have established rights. If you try to force them out, I will have you in court on Monday morning." I leaned slightly toward the phone, resting on the linen cloth. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy authority of someone who holds all the leverage. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison," I said calmly. "I suggest you check your email. I just forwarded you the security footage timestamped at 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon, showing your clients breaking and entering. Furthermore, the property is now owned by Vanguard Commercial Real Estate under registration number 8472. You are currently advising your clients to commit a federal commercial trespassing offense against a billion-dollar entity." There was a profound, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the lawyer calculating the massive liability he was walking into. Adeline, Mr. Harrison's voice returned. The aggression was completely gone. He sounded terrified. "Get out of that house immediately. I cannot represent you in a corporate trespassing case. Do not call me again." The line clicked dead. Adeline stared at the disconnected phone screen, the last shred of her delusional hope shattering into microscopic dust. The false counterattack had failed entirely. They had tried to bring a wooden stick to a drone strike. The silence that followed the disconnected call was absolute. The mechanical drone of the refrigerator hummed in the background. Melissa had stopped crying and was now staring vacantly at the wall, her mind completely unable to process the velocity of her ruin. Stephen looked like a deflated balloon. The sheer overwhelming power of the corporate legal system had crushed his ego in a matter of seconds. He realized that Mr. Harrison, the man he paid thousands of dollars to act as his personal attack dog, had abandoned him. The moment real power entered the room, they were completely exposed. There was no one left to manipulate, no one left to bribe, and no one left to endure their abuse. I picked up my wine glass and finished the last drop of the vintage red. I set the glass down and looked at the 3 people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. The illusion was dead. I stood up from the head of the table. I walked slowly toward the front hallway, pulling my long, heavy wool coat from the closet. The wind outside had picked up, driving a cold, relentless Chicago rain against the beautiful stained glass windows. I opened the heavy front door, letting the freezing, damp air rush into the warm house. "You have exactly 5 minutes to leave," I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the hallway. If you are not off this property when the clock strikes 7, I am pressing the silent alarm that connects directly to the local police precinct. They did not argue. They did not utter a single word of protest. The crushing weight of the evidence, the loss of David's money, and the terrifying reality of the Vanguard security team had completely broken their spirits. Stephen walked out first, his head bowed, his heavy footsteps echoing in defeat. Adeline followed, grabbing Melissa by the arm and pulling her along. Melissa stumbled over the threshold, clutching her stomach, stepping out into the freezing torrential rain without an umbrella. They did not have time to gather the boxes they had so arrogantly hauled in just 24 hours earlier. They left with absolutely nothing. I watched them trudge down the wet sidewalk, their figures shrinking into the dark, stormy night. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I pushed the heavy oak door closed. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp, metallic snap. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The next morning at exactly 6 o'clock, 3 black sport utility vehicles pulled up to the curb. A team of highly professional corporate security guards stepped out ready to secure the asset for Vanguard. I met the lead officer on the front porch. I handed him the brass keys, signed a brief transfer document, and walked down the steps with my single suitcase. I did not look back at the Victorian house. It had served its purpose. I walked 2 blocks down the street to a warm, brightly lit coffee shop. I ordered a hot latte and sat by the window watching the city wake up. My bank account was full. My mind was incredibly clear. The heavy, suffocating chain that had tied me to my toxic biology was permanently severed. I took a slow sip of the steaming latte, letting the rich flavor wash over my tongue. For the first time in 30 years, I did not have to worry about checking my phone for angry text messages. I did not have to mentally prepare for the subtle insults and the constant demands for my time and money. The air in my lungs felt lighter. The world outside the coffee shop window looked vibrant and full of endless, brilliant possibilities. I watched the commuters hurry past, clutching their umbrellas, living their ordinary lives. They had no idea that the woman sitting quietly in the window seat had just orchestrated a masterpiece of survival. I pulled out my laptop and opened a blank document. The past was officially sealed in a corporate vault. It was time to start drawing the blueprints for my actual future, built on a foundation that no one would ever be allowed to compromise. I was completely wonderfully free. 6 months passed, half a year of absolute silence. I had changed my phone number, deleted my old email accounts, and established a rigid firewall between my new life and the wreckage of the old one. But in a city like Chicago, news travels through the legal and professional grapevines. I received an update from David's attorney in early spring. The lawsuit had been swift and utterly devastating. Armed with the financial trace, the DNA results, and the overwhelming evidence of systemic deception, David had sued Melissa, Stephen, and Adeline for $300,000. He sued for prenatal fraud, emotional distress, and the recovery of stolen funds. They lost spectacularly. The wealthy real estate developer dropped Melissa the exact second the scandal hit the public record. He wanted nothing to do with a massive fraud investigation. Left with no wealthy savior and facing a mountain of legal judgments, Stephen and Adeline were forced to liquidate everything. They sold the car dealership at a massive loss. They sold their suburban home to pay David's settlement and their own exorbitant legal fees. The grand, luxurious life they felt, so fundamentally entitled to, completely vanished. According to the reports, the 3 of them were now living together in a cramped, damp 2-bedroom apartment in a deeply undesirable neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The poetic justice of their situation was almost literary. Adeline had once looked at me defending Melissa's cheating and stealing and cheerfully declared that a house is merrier with more people. Now she was trapped in a tiny, suffocating space with the very monster she had created. Without me there to act as their emotional punching bag and financial safety net, they had no one left to abuse but each other. They spent their days screaming, fighting, and blaming one another for their absolute ruin. The golden child was now a massive, bankrupt burden. The proud patriarch was a broke, disgraced man, and the enabling mother was trapped in the hell of her own design. I felt absolutely nothing for them. No guilt, no lingering sadness, and no desire to ever see their faces again. They had engineered their own destruction through sheer greed and toxic entitlement. I deleted the email from David's attorney and permanently closed the file. There is a profound difference between seeking revenge and simply allowing consequences to happen. I did not ruin their lives. I simply removed myself as their shock absorber. When a toxic system loses its primary target, it inevitably collapses inward, crushing the architects under its own dead weight. They had built their entire existence on the assumption that they could always take what was mine. When the vault was finally locked, they starved. It was a mathematical certainty. I closed my laptop and looked around my beautiful sunlit apartment. It was smaller than the Victorian house, but it was filled entirely with peace. There were no ghosts here, no lingering echoes of insults, no constant fear of invasion. I had traded square footage for serenity, and it was the greatest transaction of my entire life. The scales were perfectly balanced. It was a bright Tuesday morning when I unlocked the glass doors to my brand new architectural firm. The space smelled of fresh cedar wood, expensive coffee, and crisp blueprint paper. I had used a significant portion of the cash from the Vanguard sale to launch my own business. But I did not just build a firm for high-end corporate clients. I established a separate division, fully funded by my own capital, called the Sanctuary Foundation. The foundation provides free architectural redesign and home security upgrades for women escaping domestic abuse and financial manipulation. We change the locks. We reinforce the doors. We redesign their spaces so they no longer look like the prisons their abusers kept them in. We give them back their sanctuary. It was my way of taking the pain of my past and converting it into physical, protective armor for others. Around noon, the front door chimed. I looked up from my drafting table to see Martha walking into the lobby. She was smiling, her eyes bright and full of life again. She was carrying a large, warm apple pie baked in a simple glass dish. David had completely recovered his finances. He was in therapy, healing from the betrayal, and taking care of his mother the way he always intended to. Martha set the pie down on my desk, enveloping me in a tight, genuine hug. "I just wanted to check on my favorite architect," she said warmly, slicing a generous piece of the pie. We sat in my office eating the sweet cinnamon-laced apples, talking about art, business, and the simple joys of a quiet life. Looking at Martha, I realized something incredibly profound. For 29 years, I had agonized over the fact that my blood relatives did not love me. I thought I was broken. I thought I was unlovable. But sitting across from this kind, gentle woman who had no biological tie to me whatsoever, I felt entirely safe. I felt seen. I felt respected. Family is not determined by a genetic lottery. Family is a structure built on mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering protection. I had lost a toxic lineage, but I had gained a genuine community. I looked at the framed certificate of my firm's incorporation hanging on the wall. It bore my name, representing a legacy that no one could ever pack into a black trash bag and throw away. The Sanctuary Foundation was already processing its fifth applicant, a young mother who needed her locks changed and her windows reinforced. Every time we secured a home for someone else, a small piece of my own childhood trauma healed. Martha finished her pie and kissed my cheek before leaving to catch her train. The office fell quiet again, but it was not the lonely, echoing silence of the past. It was the peaceful, productive hum of a life well lived. I picked up my pen and drew a clean, straight line across the architectural drafting paper. I was no longer rebuilding old, broken things. I was designing something entirely new from the ground up. My real home was finally finished. There is a terrifying myth that society pushes onto us. We are told that because someone gave us life, we owe them our endless endurance. We are told that cutting off a mother, a father, or a sibling is the ultimate unforgivable sin. If you are listening to this and you are the designated black sheep of your family, I want you to hear me very clearly. You are not a rehabilitation center for broken, toxic people. You are not a bank account for their endless entitlement. You are a human being, and you have an absolute fundamental right to protect your own peace. When you finally decide to walk away, they will call you selfish. They will call you crazy. They will tell everyone who listens that you are the villain of the story. Let them. Let them keep their false narrative. You do not need to win the argument. You just need to win your freedom. Walking away does not mean you failed. It means you finally realized that the game was rigged from the very beginning. You cannot fix a foundation that was built on poison. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to strike the match, burn the illusion to the ground, and walk away into the cold, beautiful night. Because the truth is simple, and it is the only rule I live by now. Legacy isn't about what you inherit or who you obey. It's about the boundaries you build to protect your soul. Do not let the guilt consume you when the nights get quiet. The guilt is just the last lingering ghost of their manipulation, a phantom echo of the control they used to possess. Acknowledge it and then let it pass through you like wind through an open window. Realize that the space you emptied by removing them is now available to be filled with people who actually celebrate your existence. It takes a terrifying amount of courage to look at the people who raised you and decide that you deserve better than their cruelty. But the moment you make that decision, the universe opens up in ways you cannot possibly imagine. You will find your people. You will build your own fortress. And you will look back at the rubble of your past not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who survived the fire and learned how to control the flame. Protect your sanctuary at all costs. If you are the black sheep who finally walked away, share this story. Let them know we don't break, we build empires from the bricks they threw at us. Subscribe for more stories of justice and survival.